This lecture will be on Chapter 15 from the book, titled Event-Driven Programming and Animations. And before I get into this lecture, we're only going to cover event-driven programming. We're not going to talk about the animations part. That's outside the lesson objectives for this section. But I do encourage you to look at animations and learn how to do those, how to use JavaFX to create animations. Again, JavaFX is a new version of Java, so the things that you guys are learning will be something that most other Java developers have not either encountered or they have not learned in a formal setting. So it would be advantageous for you to pick up some of the concepts that, even though we don't discuss it, it still can be helpful for you as you matriculate through this program and prepare for your career in computer science. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into event handling and event programming. We're going to discuss, when it comes to creating events, and if you guys recall from Chapter 14, when we created our first Java FX UI, we had these UI components, such as buttons, but these buttons wouldn't do anything. We can click on the button and nothing would happen. And we all know from our interactions with real UIs that when a button is pressed, something happens. Well, in JavaFX, these things are called handlers, or more formally, event handlers. And there's a process to complete when it comes to implementing your handlers in your code so that when a button is pressed, you can have that handler do something. And the process is what you see here on this slide. The first thing you have to do is create the handler. The next step is to register the handler. And then somewhere you have to define your handler. There are four different ways that the book explains on how to define your handler, and we'll discuss each one of these, each way, and then compare and contrast them. So creating a handler is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. As you guys can see here, I have a handler class that I've created somewhere, and that's defined somewhere else. And then I just create an object for that handler and then just instantiate the object. We've done this in almost anything since I guess Chapter 9. We know how to do creating new objects from classes. So this is not the hard part. This is pretty much the most straightforward part. But again, the handler must be created first. And if we go into our second step, registering the handler, this is where you actually add the handler to the specific UI component that you want the handler to listen to. So here we go. The first 3 lines is creating the handler, and then down here we're going to register our handler. And as you can see, you can't see where this is defined in my code, but somewhere before all this, I've created a my button, an OK button, and a cancel button. These are all objects, and with these objects, these button objects, there's a method called setOnAction. And this is where if a button gets pressed, I can now have something happen once that button gets pressed. So the setOnAction method requires an object, a handler, something that is of a handler type, or event handler type, I should say. And then this is how you register your handler. So it's very, very important that when you are creating when we're doing this, we first create our handlers, and then we have to register our handler to a specific UI component. That's where some students get stuck. They'll do the first part, they'll create the handler, but then they'll forget or omit actually attaching that handler to the UI component. Go back to, I guess, one of these guys, where I'm actually doing the inner class, but let me go to the inner class. I'm doing the inner class, and instead of the action event, I would have a mouse event, and then for the key event, I would just have the key event. And for the key event, you have to make sure you set your focus for your text. All that's there, and then also the what you attach your listeners to is what receives when the event is fired. That's what receives the trigger. So when you guys if you guys use that code and run it, if you try to click, because I have each event attached to the text, if you try to click anywhere outside the text, then nothing will happen. But if you click on the text with your mouse, then that will fire the mouse event. But let's see here. And finally, to conclude this lecture, I have included an example where I'm using mouse events and key events. Actually, I'm using just one of each. Go ahead and look at that. That's going to be available on the website under the lab portion of the website. Now, the two important things you would like to notice. The first thing is with a key event, we need to use a method that sets the focus of the text. That's very important for everyone to key events. And then the second thing is you want to make sure that when you have a mouse event, that you tie the mouse event to whatever you want to receive the trigger. And what I mean by that is, in this particular example, I've tied the mouse event to a text. If you click anywhere else on the UI, the mouse event won't get fired. But once you click on the text, then you will see the mouse event get fired. And I know last semester students didn't fully understand that, so they would attach their mouse events to the wrong thing. So you just want to be mindful of where you're attaching your mouse event. And then also when you're doing key events, make sure you have that set text focus, or set focus. I think that's the name of the method. Set focus. It's in the code. You can see that set focus method set so that once the UI is fired, any keyboard inputs will automatically get registered to your UI. That will conclude the lecture for this chapter, and we will then get into chapter 16 next week.